interviewed Darren Byler, who's a lecturer at the University of Washington, and he studies the Uyghur people. For those of you who haven't been keeping up with international news, China at the moment has created and built mass re-education camps for the Uyghur, who are mostly, I would say, Muslims, and the stories coming out of these camps are rather horrifying and don't seem to indicate anything good is happening. So Darren has been studying the Uyghur for years. He's been over to China in the region several times, and so he talks about what is happening, the misinformation and lies the Chinese government is putting out instead, and I really recommend a listen. First, can you tell me a bit about what you do, who you are, and why you're working on the Uyghurs?
Mm-hmm. So I'm an anthropologist. I teach at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I've been working in the northwest part of China for quite a long time, since 2003. I first went there as a photographer. Was really fascinated by the situation that I saw. It's a interesting landscape. It's a desert region where people live in oasis towns. And I didn't know anything about it prior to coming to the region, and I was just taken with it. And I was interested to see that there's this group of people, around 11 million Uyghurs, that were living there in quite isolated circumstances, or to some extent isolated circumstances. But I could see as well that their society was changing. Because there was people moving into that region, the state was moving in and developing it, and so I could see that the society was going to change quickly, and so that's really what drew me into this project, was understanding how people in this region are going to cope with those changes.
As a side note, were you already a sociologist when you went there as a photographer?
No, I was just a photographer.
Oh, wow.
I
Okay.
decided after encountering these people and then working for a bit in the photography industry, that I wanted to go back to school and do a longer form sort of research project about this region.
So we've been hearing a lot recently about the Uyghurs online or in the media. Can you describe the situation happening there?
Yes, so the situation has changed for the worse, at least from the Uyghur perspective, quite dramatically in recent years. In 2009, there was large-scale protests that escalated into kind of inter-ethnic violence in the city of Urumqi, which is the capital of this province. And following that, there's large-scale crackdowns on the population. A hard strike campaign is what the state described it as, which resulted in a large-scale increase in policing and mass detentions of people suspected of crimes. In 2014, after some more violent protests and incidents, this turned into what the Chinese state called the People's War on Terror, which was directed towards Uyghurs as a population as a whole, and has since resulted in hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs being detained in re-education camps and thousands more in prisons.
Okay. I've just recently read that the UK confirms the reports of the Chinese mass re-education camps, and I've read that most Muslim majority countries have been keeping their silence. Why is that the case? Do you know?
I think it has a lot to do with trade agreements, economic opportunities that Muslim majority countries are interested in maintaining in relation to China. And so I think because of those reasons, they're afraid to speak out. I think they're also wanting to respect China's sovereignty and want China to respect theirs. And so they want to keep their hands off of this sort of situation. But it's quite appalling how some of the Muslim majority countries have responded to it by extraditing Uyghurs back to China, where they go straight to the prison camps. it's something that is hard to reckon with in terms of kind of moral.
I did not actually know that. Are there any protests happening around that?
There are some protests in places like Pakistan and India. But the countries that have deported the most Uyghurs back to China are places like Dubai or Egypt, and we haven't heard much about protests in those regions. In Turkey, there's also some support for Uyghurs.
Okay. I've read online that the re-education camps, I've read that there are 300,000 people there, and I've read that 1 million Uyghurs that have been interned there. Do you have more accurate information?
Well, it's very hard to know with certainty exactly how many people there are, but looking at a number of different sources, ranging from satellite imagery, we can see these camps being built, and we can estimate based on the number, the space that's actually built on the ground, the kind of capacity that these camps have. Yep. There's 180 or more that are documented now. And some of these camps are really the largest prisons in the world. We've also heard numerous reports from people that have been released, mostly Kazakhstan citizens that were detained sort of by mistake, that there's conditions of overcrowding in the camps. So all of that leads us to believe that the capacity of many of these camps is more or less full, that the camps are more or less full. So looking at the size that we can see, thinking about the reports we've heard from people that have either been released or have worked in these camps, we can estimate that it is somewhere in the neighborhood of 800,000 to 1 million to more. We've also seen some numbers released, sort of that were sort of leaked by the state workers of camp numbers associated with the camps, and that it placed those at over 1 million people.
Okay. I mean, I've been reading a bit more about the Uyghurs, and I didn't know a lot. And you mentioned the 2009 protests, and I read that afterwards thousands of Uyghur young men were disappeared by the state. And there was, was there no outrage around that? Was there anything done then at that time?
Well, the families of the young men that were disappeared were, of course, very upset by it. The state introduced a new form that people could fill out to record the name and information of the person that was disappeared. But there was no official inquiry placed, and none of these young men, or at least that I have heard of, have been reappeared, or any explanation has been given. It's very difficult to have any sort of political protest in China, especially in this region. Protests of any sort are very quickly labeled terrorist events by the state. They're often met directly with violence, shooting on the street, on the spot. So it's very difficult to protest anything.
When was the last time you were there?
I was there in April of this year.
April of this
2018.
year. And how much access did you have?
I was able to travel in a lot of the urban areas. I was in the capital of Urumqi, and then went to a smaller town called Turpan, which is just 2 hours or so away from the main city, and then traveled south and west to a major city called Kashgar. So I could triangulate a little bit based on those experiences going into a large city, smaller town, and then a mid-sized city. What exactly is happening on the ground. I wasn't able to travel very far beyond the city limits, though. I was stopped at checkpoints and not permitted to travel further.
What is beyond the city limits?
It's rural areas, villages, and it's really where a lot of the crackdowns are happening, is in rural areas. People that are coming from the countryside, from villages, are seen as the least educated and also the most religious. And so a lot of the policing, a lot of the people that have been disappeared, been taken to the camp system, have come from rural areas. It's affecting people in urban areas as well, but the rural areas are the hardest hit. And so they're what the state wants to prevent outsiders from seeing.
And you've obviously written about the Uyghurs, and it's not always very complimentary to the Chinese state. Have you had any problems?
So far, I haven't had any issues in terms of travel or at least coming in, being allowed to go into the country. There is now restrictions, I think, on what I'm able to see outside of kind of permitted tourist zones or urban spaces. So I think that was part of the reason why I wasn't permitted to travel into the rural areas, is because they knew that I was a researcher and wanted to prevent me from seeing more. I think I'm also watched as I travel quite a lot. Not always by police following me, but on camera systems, and they're keeping tabs on where I'm going. So I'm quite careful now about who I talk to, and because I could get them in trouble.
Yeah. Can you actually describe the state of surveillance there?
So the surveillance system is really centered around what they call a convenience police station system in urban areas, at least, which is police stations every 300 to 500 meters that are complemented by camera systems that are, in many cases, face recognition enabled, so they can track people's faces and search. They can pull up your movements in this video system. As you move down the street, you move from one camera bank to the next one, so they have a view of you no matter where you are. Then there's also random checkpoints conducted by police officers, often stationed at these convenience police stations, where they check IDs and they also check your phone. There's face scanning. Yeah, go ahead.
Was it? I assume it wasn't like this the first time you went into the region.
No, when I went there the first time for an extended period of time in 2011. There was a police presence, an active police presence, because this was after 2009 when those protests happened. But there wasn't regular checkpoints in any way. There was camera systems already that had just been installed, but those were fairly they weren't AI enabled or anything like that. They weren't smart. It wasn't a smart camera system. It was something that required a lot of manpower to actually look at. It was just closed circuit cameras. 2014 is when it really turned towards this more sophisticated form of surveillance with all of these checkpoints and data security analysis.
Going to the official Chinese story, which has changed slightly over the few weeks as interest has increased across the world. Beijing is saying that it's a reacting to a terrorism threat, and apparently there have been Uyghur terrorists that have managed to organize a suicide car crash, and there was a mass knifing attack apparently in the city of Kunming. How is there any validity to their official, let's say, reasons?
So there have been violent incidents. One of the things that happened between 2009 and 2014 was the rise of social media in the Uyghur population. Many people began to use the internet for the first time, as the internet arrived during that period of time. And so people did become more aware of kind of global movements. Most Uyghurs were not interested in political forms of Islam or Salafist forms of Islam. They were mostly interested in understanding what it means to be pious, studying kind of mainstream forms of Hanafi Sunni Islam. There was also a good deal of interest in the Hizmet movement, which is something emanating out of Turkey. So in general, Uyghurs began to appear more pious in their outward appearance in 2011 to 14.
Sorry, but by saying appearing more pious, what do you mean? Is it like more religious, as in wearing a beard or a headscarf?
Yeah, so many young men began to wear beards. They began to pray more regularly, going to the mosque 5 times a day. They were more concerned with halal forms of eating and
so basically regular Muslim stuff.
Yeah, just really regular Muslim stuff. One of the issues in the past was that Uyghurs didn't have access to Islamic education because the state regulates it very closely. But because of the internet technology, they were able to get a lot more exposure to how Muslims in other places live their lives.
But doesn't China regulate the internet?
It does, but one of the issues with the arrival of the internet, the Uyghur internet, was they were using an app called WeChat, which is a social media app that allows Uyghurs to use spoken word. So they were just using speech, and that allowed them to listen to a number of to recordings or teachings, which they call tabligh.
Okay.
And the state didn't have a way of regulating that for around 3 years because they didn't know, they didn't have the technology to recognize Uyghur speech or to transcribe it, to translate it into Chinese. So they couldn't really censor it very accurately. So for a number of years, for 3 years, people were using this technology fairly freely.
Okay.
And not being too worried about the censorship. They felt like the state wasn't really paying attention, and so they were really taking advantage of the freedom. So all of that is to say that there was a turn towards piety among the population as a whole. It's not that they weren't pious before, but new forms of piety is what they were interested in. So the state was paying attention to that. They said, oh, why are these Muslims dressing differently? And then there was also a rise in what appeared to be religiously motivated violence, protest. But those incidents were very small. I mean, relative to the population as a whole, there was 3 or 4, 5 maybe of those incidents. Mostly they were not, I don't think, actually directly ideologically motivated. Most of the acts of violence were motivated not by ideology, but by feelings of loss, by immediate injustice in a person's family. Someone's uncle, someone's brother, someone's father being taken, maybe shot on the street or taken to prison without real, trial. And so it's, a loss in the family is really what motivated a lot of the violence. But there was a few instances of violence, one in Kunming, one in Beijing, and a couple instances in Urumqi, where, people appeared to be carrying out an attack or violent act in association with a sort of religious Islamic motivation. They were carrying flags and things like that. So the state used that as a way of saying we have a problem with terrorism as a whole, and that the population of Uyghurs that were turning towards these more pious forms of Islam, that they were extremists, and conflating their piety with a kind of political motivation, or they were politicizing religious practice.
And that's when the re-education camps came out?
Yeah, the re-education camps came out not immediately, but within, or at least at the scale that they've emerged now. They began in 2014, and then they were really amplified in 2016 when we saw kind of this mass detention of hundreds of thousands of people.
You've actually written an article about the citizens that occupy Uyghur homes. Can you tell me a bit about that and how effective it's been?
Right. So this process is not just affecting Uyghurs. It's placed around a tenth of the Uyghur population in these camps, but it's also affected around a tenth of the Han population in the province. So Han is the majority group in China. It's the group that's kind of occupying the Uyghur homeland. So they've sent around 1 million Han civilian workers to Uyghur homes to monitor those that remain outside of the camps. They primarily target families of those that have been detained. That's one of their first priorities. And when they arrive in the Uyghur homes, they observe the kind of loyalties they have to the people that have been detained. They're looking for any forms of religiosity that might remain, looking for signs like on the walls of any sort of religious symbols. And then they also perform a lot of kind of religious tests. So they ask people to drink alcohol with them, to smoke cigarettes, to swear allegiance to China, to the party, in some cases to denounce Islam, things like that. So it is interesting the way that the kind of what these civilian workers talk about as a patriotism or nationalism, the way it takes on a sort of religious fervor. It's something that is a part of life as a whole. So part of embodied everyday practice is to be a patriotic citizen, and you need to perform that over and over again on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. I noticed in your article that the citizens doing this did not find it morally reprehensible in any way.
Yeah, I think some of them recognize that this would be a difficult process for Uyghurs, that they could see that, first of all, having so many people be taken into these camps was an issue for Uyghurs, but also that, that their faith and their cultural, background, all those values are being kind of erased or diminished. And I think they could recognize that that was a difficult process. I think, though, most of them felt as though it was a necessary process. So they said this was going to be difficult for Uyghurs, but in the end, it will have the benefit of Uyghurs being secularized and becoming modern. They often talk about Uyghurs as being backward and uneducated, and so they saw what they were doing as a kind of benevolence, a way of educating and bringing Uyghurs into the modern Chinese nation.
Okay. One thing I did want to touch upon is why now? Why 2018 for the year? This may be just a wrong perception because I wasn't paying attention to the issue before, but why has it suddenly acquired importance?
Well, the camp build out and occupation, the sending of this, 1 million Uyghurs to these camps happened in 2017. And I think it's taken a bit of time for people to kind of reckon with that. There was a lot of doubt as to the accuracy of these numbers. What is actually happening in the camps? It wasn't clear. And so it took quite a bit of time to convince people that this is really happening, that it's important. Uyghurs are a stateless people, and because of that, they don't have a lot of institutional support around the world. And so just getting people to recognize who these people are and what's happening to them has taken a lot of work. I think, though, that now that some of the stories have come out of what's happening in the camps, what's happening to the children that have been sent to orphanages as a result of their parents being taken, these really moving human stories, I think those have really captured people's attention and made people realize that this is something that everyone should care about.
You've written one on Rahil Dawood, which I read. Can you tell me a bit about her?
Yeah, Rahila is a really eminent folklore scholar. She studies Uyghur folklore and also the geography of mazars, which are shrines for those that brought Islam to the Uyghurs in centuries past. And she's someone that's mentored many graduate students in anthropology and in folklore studies, both Uyghur and Western students. And she had spent a year here in the University of Washington, where I'm at, as a visiting scholar, and went back to China 2 years ago. And was living in China for a year in 2016, relatively unscathed. In January of 2017, she was actually featured on the cover of Xinjiang Women's Magazine as a sort of success story of how a minority person could become a successful academic. But then at the end of the year, 2017, December, she was taken, disappeared really by the state. We don't really know what's happening to her now. She was told to pack her bags for an important meeting. And then as she was leaving to go to this meeting, she was taken. So we haven't heard really what she's been charged with, or if she's going to be charged with something. We don't know if she's in the re-education camp or is in prison, but it's been quite a shock.
I can imagine. Did you personally know her?
Yeah, I knew her quite well. We've known each other since 2014, and yeah.
So I guess my final question would be, where do you think this is heading now? Do you think there's going to be an impact from international pressure? And I know I'm kind of sending you all types of questions, political, historical, etc. I'd like your take on it.
Well, from the Chinese perspective, engaging in, they say, is a project to protect the population of China as a whole from the threat of terrorism. So they see it as a security effort. And they talk about this as producing what they call long-term stability or long-term security. That's a sort of final solution that they have for what they call the Xinjiang problem. So I think now there's a considerable amount of momentum in China towards this project. Lots and lots of resources have been invested in it. It's also a center for developing new forms of technology, computer vision technology, which China, I think, is seeing as an exportable product that they're hoping to send to other countries in the future. So because of those reasons, I think there's a lot of momentum in China to keep this thing going and to follow through on it. I think as other states get invested in or become aware of what's happening to the Uyghurs, there might be more pushback. There could be some sanctions towards some of these companies that are involved and towards some of these leaders. But it's very difficult to foresee any kind of resolution that would come forward quickly. So it feels as though this is something that will play out over the long term, maybe the next 10 to 20 years, as Uyghurs, a generation of Uyghurs are sort of lost in this process, and a new generation that's trained in the Chinese education system is brought up.
So these re-education camps are here to stay in the near future?
That's my sense. I'm not hopeful that there will be a resolution that would make them go away quicker. It doesn't mean that we can't fight, and we should fight, and we need to continue to, make the voices of these people heard as we can.
What can people do as you said, the situation is grim? Is there any hope? Is there any small action any person, like the average listener to this podcast, can take?
One of the things that people can do in locations around the world is come alongside the Uyghurs that are in diaspora. Many of them are, without their family members. Many of them have family members in these camps, and they're now without a country and without a state. So there's stateless people in diaspora, and they need support from the community around them. Many of them need legal assistance, as they are many still on a Chinese passport, and so they need to find refuge in other states. So legislators and community folks, they can come alongside them and support them as they can. In terms of other things people could do, I think, placing pressure on their politicians is something that could have some effect, hopefully, in making this story more widely understood, and also maybe preventing some of the extreme forms of violence that are happening. The biggest concern for most of us is that we don't want to see anything like mass death that could come out of this sort of a camp system, as has happened in other camp systems in the past. And so I think continuing to keep a light on this is something that could prevent some of that from happening.
And on that note, thank you very much, Darren.